Good morning, everyone, and welcome to part 3 of Forthright's webinar series on understanding risks in Microsoft 365. I'm Kristen from Forthright, and we are very thankful for your time today. This is the third, for those of you who haven't joined us for the previous two, this is the third session of the series. And if you missed any of the previous two, please email us and we'd be happy to send you the recording. But for now, I am going to turn it over to Steve Zoberg to talk a little bit about Forthright.
All right, thanks, Kristen. Good morning, everyone. I want to start by thanking all of you for joining us today on our spotlight session for this morning. Our conversation is going to be focused around data lifecycles and workspace governance issues. I'm Steve Zoberg, as Kristen said, Chief Revenue Officer at Forthright. And for those of you who've joined us but haven't worked with Forthright before, I wanted to give you a quick 1-minute intro. Promise very quick. Into Forthright, we've been helping clients optimize their application delivery for decades. And for us, it's more than just a matter of picking the right tools and technology. It's about how do we supercharge your end user experiences? And how do we do that while driving efficiency and productivity gains for your business? So we've built our practice around being user-centric in everything that we do. And essentially what that means is that our passion and focus is not centered around what tools or products or processes might be optimal for us or from an IT stack, but rather we put ourselves in your shoes. We pay very close attention to the experience and outcomes of your team and, of course, your entire end user population. So Forthright offers 6 core services. Go to the next slide real quick. That essentially focus on helping you deliver consistent and exceptional user experiences for your organization. And if you're interested in talking about any of these more, we'd love to sit down and meet with you and kind of go over the different categories of how we deliver these services. Give us a ring, send us a quick note at success@forthright.com, and we'd be happy to follow up with you. Now, today's conversation, as Kristen mentioned, this is part 3 of a 3-part series where we've been exploring topics around Microsoft 365 related data. And we've discussed how to protect it. We've discussed risk management, optimizing your ROI, gaining situational awareness on where your sensitive data actually is, and truly understanding who has access to it. And of course, global administration issues that many people face along the way. So if you're here today, it's probably because you're concerned with the who, what, where, and why as it pertains to your data. And it turns out you're not alone. A recent poll cited 42% of organizations felt that understanding how to best address the data governance was their biggest challenge last year. And 66% who were polled didn't even have a data governance strategy currently in place. So at the end of the day, we all want to collaborate easily, right? We want to do this with a great user experience, and we want to do it with confidence that we're not violating regulations and we're not causing harm to anyone in the process. And I think if I think back over the last several years, we used to address most of this with DLP solutions, but things have become far more complicated, right? With the data that's showing that the way that we're actually working and the way that we're collaborating and sharing data over the last few years, it's undergone a massive shift toward Microsoft 365 and other cloud platforms, of course. And if we look at 365, which is what we're going to talk about today, this was designed to be easy for the users. It was designed to be user-centric. And the funny thing is that we've empowered users not just to share data, but all sorts of content. And they can deploy and share even applications tied to 365. So this has kind of led us to observe and address a plethora of new challenges that we're not necessarily used to dealing with over the last couple of years. And they're not really obvious on the surface until you start playing out very specific scenarios. So today, we're going to share some of our experience that we've had with governance issues, and we're going to discuss this with Frank Marino, our COO, and Jay Hall, a senior solutions engineer over at AvePoint. And we'll go over some excellent ways of how we can actually address these issues as we kind of walk through them. Before we kick this off, I wanted to give a special thanks to Frank. He is so passionate on this topic that he has joined us on his vacation week. So Frank, really, really appreciate you jumping on. Thank you. And Jay, of course, thank you for joining us again for this 3rd series. And I thought, for anybody who may miss the earlier ones, maybe you could tell us a little bit about AvePoint, and then we can jump right in and talk about and start this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for that, Steve. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. For anyone who's not familiar, I am the channel solution engineer here at AvePoint who's been supporting Forthright with regards to these webinars. And the idea here is that AvePoint is the largest ISV as it pertains to the Microsoft 365 stack. We specialize primarily in either migrations, management, governance, and data protection with regards to all of M365. And so really the idea here is that everything you're seeing on the screen is really just kind of talking a little bit about who we are, what we do, but then more importantly, is going to be the fact that we do this across 20 plus years of experience. And that really just means for you all that when you're partnering with AvePoint, you're partnering with Forthright, you're getting the best breed of experience, right? We have expertise across a wide variety of industries and verticals. And so there's no one size fits all. We touch customers everywhere from the one user seat size all the way up to enterprise organizations. And so we have a lot of expertise that we bring to the table in enabling partners like Forthright to deliver the kind of services that you as customers really need. And with that, I think we can jump over to the next slide. And so really at this point, right, what we're trying to do today is to give everyone a little bit more insight into that last and final piece and aspect of M365, right? We talked about data protection, ROI, license management, and controls. But what we haven't done is kind of bridge the gap and talked about what all of those things really mean to an organization. And effectively, what we're trying to do is enable organizations to collaborate with confidence. And so everything that I'm going to talk about along with Frank and Steve today is really designed to make sure that everyone here understands not only what governance is, but more importantly, how it can empower everyone in your organization from the individuals all the way up to the CEOs and the COOs who are going to build out those practices required to make your organization operate efficiently and effectively. We can go to the next slide.
Jay, you might want to adjust your lapel mic. I think it's, or is your earphone? Yeah, okay.
Is it a little bit too loud or can you just not hear me?
There's some crackle.
Okay.
Not quite sure where it's what it's brushing up against. Kristen, let's go to the next slide. That's an interesting point, by the way, of the fact of kind of going over this governance, because one thing we've definitely seen through many conversations is I don't know that I've sat in meetings with multiple clients that all define governance the same way.
Yep. And even when we were talking amongst ourselves, right, the reality is that governance means something different to everyone. Case in point, whether you're talking to a COO or CEO versus a support engineer or a sales rep, there's a clear distinction that each individual has a different definition and a different motivation, right? And so the problem then becomes, how do we address those differences? What can we do in order to ensure that the compliance and governance needs of the business enable and empower the actual end users to operate effectively? Frank, you had a great quote around this when we were talking before about how we shouldn't be looking at productivity and governance as a versus, but rather, how do we create an engine that the business can operate within and under that can streamline and make everyone's lives easier and more effective?
That sounds smart, so I'm going to say it was me who said it, but I think it was you.
I appreciate the throwback here. So we can transition a little bit through this one. But the idea here is that what we're trying to do is give you the building blocks needed in order to effectively build that confidence platform, right? The ability to create that governance such that whatever your business is defining, whether that might be from a external requirement or an internal requirement, there's going to be some level of operational understanding that the business has agreed upon that can then be set in motion in order to drive the different types of collaboration that are required to get that full value out of your everyday day-to-day tasks. We can go to the next slide. Steve, this is some of those points that you were talking about before. And I don't know if you just kind of want to reiterate, because I thought some of the things that you found here were pretty relevant.
Sure. I mean, it's definitely really interesting to understand the increase in, and I think we all know it, right? We've all gone through this transition already through COVID. But when you actually look at the impact of the increase in collaboration tools between organizations, you look at the increase on the download rate of Microsoft Teams alone, which is quite shocking. And obviously there's multiple different use cases for this. The active Teams user count right now in 2023, I think if you go back several years, it was something like 2 million. So this has just exploded over a very short period of time of just a few years. And then of course the amount of data that we're creating in general. And now we have new ways, because it used to be create data and put it on a file server, and they had very specific controls. And now we're creating all this data, and it's located in a lot of different places, and it's, you know, has different levels of sensitivity. So yeah, we just wanted to kind of share some of these recent statistics. There's a link if you want to review the actual report on this as well that we can share with you.
My takeaway to give for everyone on the call today is that the statistics are showing growth, and that's wonderful for those that probably work at Microsoft. But what it really means for us is that it's a problem that existed at the onset of this. It's just that the adoption rate is so significant. Something that could have been addressed when it was an anthill is now realistically is a mountain. And I think all of us have been in a meeting, executives, departments, looking to advance their use of the Microsoft 365 stack. And so just keep that in mind as we continue to go down this road, because you're going to see that the problem started at day one when we decided to do that. Actually, the problem has always been there. It's just that the focus on how 365 is catered towards the end user, as Steve mentioned, as where the problem actually started there. But we'll go into that a little further. Back to you, Jay.
No, you're absolutely right. And so this kind of bleeds into what we're seeing here, right? The commonality here is that the digital transformation journey and story, most people tend to think of it as a very linear path, right? We start from that on-premise or from a different environment. We do some sort of licensing to M365, we migrate your data, and then we start to enable the end users as they begin to push there. The problem is at this stage, we then get to that point where how do we start to ensure that everything that we've enabled end users to do remains compliant? Because compliancy isn't just about internal rights, right? It's also about managing risk. The reality is that no matter who you are, what organization you're within, there's always going to be a risk factor, whether that's potential ransomware, whether that's a disgruntled employee, whether that's a full disaster recovery situation where your building was set on fire. It doesn't matter. There's something that you need to address. And so having the proper governance and controls in place can help mitigate some of these risks. But what we've learned, and if we go to the next slide, you're going to see is it doesn't really work this way, right? It's not always a linear path. Many of you on this call, you're probably already in M365. And so for you, you're probably starting somewhere in this actual cycle, right? You're not necessarily going from a external system into M365. You might already be there. In fact, you might already be protecting your data with a backup solution. So now what you're trying to do is figure out, how do we remain in a scenario and in a situation where we're constantly evolving the way that our users can function and work, along with the business practices and applications that are integrated into M365 in such a manner that we're continuing to expand and grow and do this in an effective manner that doesn't begin to stunt the ability for users and employees to be able to operate effectively and efficiently. And so for us, rather than think of it as that linear path, we really like to look at it as more of a cycle that's constantly growing and changing, where we're plugging and playing the pieces and components that we need to in order to adopt a more appropriate strategy.
You know, and this really resonates. This resonates with me a lot, because from an IT perspective, we think about these projects and we think about M&A acquisitions, or we think about we need to move data from a file server to this concept of getting data from one system and then moving it to a new one. That is a point in time. And I think as an industry, we're very good at dealing with that. What's interesting is this cycle is happening actually every single day in perpetuity, because what's happening is we're not only creating new data on our own and uploading it, but we're receiving data from our vendors, from our partners, from our clients, and that data needs to be placed somewhere depending on the sensitivity and the content of it. And the truth is that most people, when they're leveraging Teams, are not always actually placing it in the right place or sharing it correctly. And the original controls that were put in place during the implementation were based on this concept of moving a data set, i.e. from a file server, for example, where I know what that is, moving it in one place and my job is done. And from a governance standpoint, I think the interesting challenge is how do we deal with now the day 2, day 3, day 4, where everyone is constantly, we saw this, creating all of this data on a regular basis. And we have to trust the user on where they're going to put it and how they're going to treat it.
Yep, no, absolutely. And so if you go to the next slide, right, it just kind of helps to paint that picture of doing this from a higher level, right? Rather than focusing on that individual cycle all of the time, if we start to kind of give you a little bit more of an abstract view, what you can start to see is that there's just things that are common that always have to happen, right? Modernizing your data, modernizing your workspaces, building a resiliency strategy, and making sure that your business stays operable under duress. And then finally being able to, like you were just talking about, Steve, take those controls and those governance applications and build them in such a way that users can start to adopt while continuously making sure that they stay within the confines of what we're expecting as a business we need to do. And so I think this kind of bleeds into the next slide where when we were trying to define what governance means, right? What we ultimately settled on is there's a myriad of different ways we can define this. One way that we've learned to define it would be IT governance, right? That broad overview of something that an organization has to do in order to meet certain compliance and regulations, to streamline their business processes and make someone effectively able to collaborate in a way that is both secure, safe, minimizes risk, but at the same time is effective and quick. But IT governance is a wide thing, right? And so what we're going to do today is kind of break it down a little bit into two main buckets, operational versus data. And the key here is going to be, we understand that as a user, we're always thinking about how to empower our users. But if we try to do everything at a user level, what you often end up doing is kind of staying behind the curve, right? And so what can we do from that higher level standpoint at those workspaces, right? Whether those are Teams, SharePoint sites, maybe we're talking about your email. What can we do at the highest level that can then trickle down to make sure that everything that we're doing day to day can be bubbled back up to every user, such that we're not building policies for specific individuals, but rather for whole departments or business applications and folks who might meet a specific role criteria. And that cycle, if we go to the next slide, is where governance kind of starts to go, right? Going from that container to the content and constantly evolving such that we might start at the highest level and then work our way down. But at some point, we have to reevaluate what we're doing and make sure that our current governance strategy is still up to date, it's still applicable, and that it's using the latest technologies that could effectively meet any criteria that we might have had, but not necessarily got the chance to implement before. Because at the end of the day, governance isn't a, I do it once, I set it and forget it, right? It's something that constantly evolves as your organization potentially scales or grows, or even just changes altogether.
So let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about the benefits or the end game, right?
Yep. And so I think these are things that Frank was kind of hitting on already, right? But the reality is some of these components, what we're trying to make sure that we can do is that it's scalable, right? That it's repeatable, it's effective, and it's efficient. And so organizations like AvePoint, partnering with Forthright, give you the ability to have not only the right tools, but also have someone who's there to consult you and advise you on those potential governance strategies, things that you might not have thought about, right? Making sure that there is some way that you're going to be able to do this implementation, manage it effectively, and then be able to kind of catalog and processize this whole thing. So when push comes to shove, you have documentation that explains not only what's been done, why it's been done, how it's been done, but more importantly, if something were to go wrong, and unfortunately the reality is something's invariably going to go wrong, right? But being prepared for it means you have a better way to get back up and running very quickly once it's actually occurred.
All right, so let's talk about how we address, I guess, the risk, right? How do we prioritize that?
Yep.
Chris, let's go to the next slide, Kristen.
And so prioritizing risk, right? Let's just take an example, right? There's a lot of different risks out there that we could potentially be worried about. One of them that we can focus on is just users, right? And so I think a commonality here that we're going to really try to focus on and drive home is that these are things that people have to think about every day, even if you aren't necessarily an admin, right? Worrying about who has access to your information and into your data. These are all things that we could pull from M365, but some of us will have to be experts in PowerShell, or you might have to have higher levels of permissions. Being able to then figure out who did what with that data, right? Because at the end of the day, if I know that you have access to it, that doesn't mean you did anything with it, which means there might not even be a risk in the first place. But let's say you did access something. What did you access? Now we need to know what type of data and what type of information is there. And so being able to figure out is there sensitive information is going to be very important as well. Here's the challenge. All of these things, they're across multiple different interfaces, multiple different portals, even with varying levels of access that you need to have. In order to be able to grab this information, I'd have to be a full global admin with rights on my own machine. Now, I don't know about you, Steve, but I don't have admin rights on my own actual machine. And so what that means is our governance strategies have already been put in place to kind of limit what users can do for a reason. So being able to get that visibility, be able to get that insight requires that someone has all of that level of access. Being able to take every single one of those bits of information is great, but it has no context. And so risk without context really doesn't help you, right? How do you actually take that information and then build something that can then be pushed back to your business users?
So I think your context point is really good. And what we should do now is let's take a use case and let's talk about that use case. And we'll kind of bring this up in a couple of different places during the conversation. And remember, I was telling you that sometimes it's very obvious that we understand what the impact is, and sometimes we have to play out the scenarios to its completion for us to truly understand the impact. And this one, the offboarding process for users. We all go through this. I know Frank has a ton of experience on this. We've helped organizations even automate this process, and it definitely tends to be more complex than it would seem on the surface. And so, Frank, maybe start the conversation, kind of walk us through this for some of the obvious things, right, that are part of the governance standpoint and what we need to worry about from this perspective. And then as we continue the presentation, we'll come back to this example and we'll continue playing it out so that way everyone can kind of relate to the impact, because I think sometimes it's hard to understand unless you can contextualize it.
Yeah, so I think that one thing that we've all in IT have experienced is the need to offboard someone. We're going to call it offboarding, but the truth is that whether it's a termination due to something malicious or a layoff or something like that, there's an offboarding of an individual or individuals. But ultimately, the role in which that individual or individuals have been doing still needs to be done by somebody. And so, the first thing we always do is like, okay, we have to ensure that this person or persons do not have access to the environment anymore. So nowadays we have remote access, we have email, we deal with that. For those in IT that deal with that on the operations side, I'm sure you've already had that weird phone call from either HR or some sort of management level, and they like, hey, today someone's going to be let go, and they kind of leave it vague at that, and then they kind of tell you 5 minutes before so that you deal with that. And that's kind of how most organizations deal with it. The reality of that is that all of you have addressed is that person or persons ability to connect to the systems that are being provided by the organization, whether that be email, remote access, VPN, those kind of things, right? If you have an asset of some sort, like a laptop, computer, or something like that, then there's usually some other components that have to be dealt with that way. Shipping out a box to for those that are remote, or confiscating that device prior to the exit of a building or whatever. And then you may have a process to wipe and reissue that that device back in inventory and stuff like that. So that is mostly what we think of in the offboarding process. The reality, though, is that in the what we call the modern workplace, which I absolutely hate that term, but Jay always likes to use it, so I figured I would use it this time. But what that really means is that that control we had in our file servers, our on-prem Active Directory systems, our firewall, stuff like that. Yeah, that's kind of now bleeding into this user-controlled data access, right? So we've given people access to the services of Microsoft 365, and we can create controls around that. We've probably created vague controls, and therefore they're using OneDrive to share things, Teams to share things, SharePoint to share things, or maybe you're one of those that use, we talked about in a previous series around licensing. You've enabled, because you get E3 or E5 licenses, Microsoft 365, E5 or 3.3, and therefore they have things like Core Apps, Flow, and they've now gone into the Power element. You probably didn't even know that, but Microsoft makes it very easy for user to go ahead and take advantage of these platforms, and all of that is now tied to a user that is no longer there. But what you've done is remove that person or persons from that information, and we stop there. The problem is that in many cases these are being used for business functions that we had no visibility into or even cared for up until 5 minutes before that person was let go. And now that's what we're talking about here, is that having a better understanding of what to do when that person is no longer there, having an understanding of what they have done in some recent history, because let's say that's I don't know, let's add some context from the type of individual. It's somebody that deals with your external customer. So they're interfacing, sharing files, or communicating at some capacity, right? Or maybe it's a project manager, and therefore is interfacing with multiple teams and is controlling elements within a project, both internal resources and external resources. Resources in this example is people. And so you've given access to these folks, and we just assume that everyone's doing it and is doing it for the role or function that they're doing, and that may be true. But then again, now Frank's no longer with us, and Steve's going to take over. And so what we need to make sure that Steve can be effective in doing what Frank's doing, right? And just saying that, all right, Steve, you have the same access as Frank, that's not going to necessarily translate to continuing that function. That person now, in this case, example, Steve, will have to see what's there and kind of like create his own map of what was Frank doing, or ask other resources that were on the project or that had interface with Frank recently. And those things are still going to happen, because not all things are done with inside of 365. But the vast majority of what my correspondence was, or the things that I was communicating or sharing out to other people, or even the things that I was actually doing that were exclusive to my own user. Again, examples of this are the Power Platform, that's all individually driven, or maybe my flows that I created again on the Power Platform that are used for, hey, when this email comes in or this notification comes in, go ahead and do this action, update this Excel spreadsheet, or drop this file because it came into my project mailbox, drop it into our Teams location. Little things like that people do to help automate and progress their productivity, which is a huge thing that people are doing these days. Well, it's all tied to Frank. And just giving Steve access to the Teams or the SharePoint doesn't mean that those functions were going to continue. But nobody knows. Steve's just there and he's like, hey, the customer says they're sending files, but I don't see it in our Teams. Well, it's because what they was originally doing is that the customer was sending files and was maybe sending it to like a site mailbox or a shared mailbox of some sort. And then we created a rule or a function that was dropping it into Teams, or was going to my OneDrive, which is still going to my OneDrive, but Steve doesn't have access to my OneDrive. Maybe my boss has access to that OneDrive, and he or she has no idea that file is even relevant. And so, the removal of that individual is where we stop in most cases for IT, and then just immediately say, okay, management of this person, my boss, Kristen, Hugo, you're now responsible to figure out what Frank was doing and how, who's going to take over. She selected Steve and said, hey, IT, make sure that Steve has access to Frank's data. And IT did just that. The reality, though, is that there's so many layers to that we have to be talking about. And I wanted to point out this specific example because, one, everyone on this call has to have gone through this at one point in time. Maybe you yourself have gone through this as you were the person either who was offboarded, or you're the person dealing with the offboarding of somebody else, or maybe you were one of the decision people that had to deal with that, or a part of a team and you were impacted. At some point in time, you were impacted by offboarding. So this affects everybody on this call. As you start adding your own personal context to it, you start seeing like, hey, you know what? I do remember getting access to Sally or Jim's files, but I wasn't able to do their job effectively or even take over that function for weeks, months, possibly a year. These things really, they're happening, and they're now progressing even further. As we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar,
Lost your last
there's a
several
huge
seconds,
adoption rate that just continues, making it very easy. Oh, you lost me?
The last several seconds, yeah.
Ooh.
And I can't help but think about
camera.
the
I'm
life
sorry,
cycle,
guys. I don't have the best
connection. You still there?
I'm going to turn off my camera, see if that makes it any better. I apologize for that. Yes, I am still here. Do you hear me?
That's good. Yeah. It's interesting because I start thinking about the life cycle of data, and I'm looking at this guy in the picture with a smile on it as he's clearly receiving access to data that he has no idea what he has, because at this point it's a very reactive process. And at best you can go look for something, but of course you don't actually know what you're looking for or why you're looking for it until something has broken and someone's coming for it. There's a lot that's not seen and not visible. Did you want to continue on your process, your thought process?
The only thing I was going to add to that was that apologies for the video, guys. The only thing I was going to add to that was just that when we think about how we handle things today, right? IT did what they were supposed to do, right? They gave, per the instruction of Chris and my boss, to give access to Steve, right? And so Steve received it, he did his part, and now has to figure it out. And Kristen did her part, is saying, okay, who's going to get access? Oh, Steve. Yes, that's who's going to get it. And so everyone did their role, their function based on what was in front of them. But I think that the word context is something that has been continuously used throughout this presentation. And I think that's the element that has been missing in all of the things that we're doing. So having a way to gain context, whether that be the actions that I've been doing, in this case, I'm the offboarded individual. That's one area that's huge. Things leading up to that offboarding. So let's say, several weeks to a month leading off to that, and then just making sure that what I can do is also limited as well, because if everyone has keys to the kingdom to do anything, all the things, well, then that makes it that much harder to actually be effective as to what it is that I need to now have Steve responsible for in this example, right? In the analogy I like to use for everyone who is into Formula One racing, the only reason these cars or the Formula race is even entertaining to begin with is that it is happening in a closed course, right? They can go crazy fast. They have they're going down streets we all know, whether that be downtown Miami or Dallas or some other city that I don't know. I don't follow a lot of racing, but the analogy works. They're going 200 plus miles an hour. Why? Because it's a closed course, right? We've empowered these drivers to do what they need to do to entertain us and move as fast as possible within this closed course. Now imagine, for those that live in South Florida, imagine Miami rush hour traffic and this Formula One racer is sitting on I-95 trying to do 200 miles an hour. That is never going to work. In fact, you're lucky if they're going 20 miles an hour, and I can tell you as a spectator, I don't want to see a car going 20 miles an hour. That's not very exciting. And so, and I think that's kind of what we're saying, is that if everybody has, it's all open and it's not a closed course, it makes it that much harder for everyone to do the things they're supposed to do, the spectators to enjoy. The spectators in this case would be your customers, the drivers, the person who's actually in that car, the person who's delivering the content to your customer. It makes it that much harder. But we all kind of like self-enclose ourselves with what we can do. But obviously, without any kind of meaningful controls in place, that's where we're at. So, Steve,
That's
you were going to go
really,
somewhere. I'm going to pass it back.
yeah, that's really interesting when you think about the life cycle. And I guess from a context standpoint, Jay, maybe we can talk about, let's go to the next slide, how proper governance and the correct tools to actually drive this can help your business operate at that pace, that speed, right? Because now you've put up certain guardrails, because the way it's built right now, when someone is offboarded for, regardless of what the reason is, it takes a significant toll on the efficiency of the business. And sometimes it's obvious, and sometimes we don't see it until down the road, and we'll continue to explore that conversation. But talk about this. I mean, maybe you can help us understand some practical applications of governance that can actually help put the proper guardrails so we can run at a indie speed.
Yep. No, and what Frank just talked about is exactly the importance of governance, right? It's not just about limiting what people can do. It's more importantly about making sure that you can go 100 miles an hour, because you know you couldn't possibly break something. You couldn't possibly cause data loss. So empowering end users with self-enablement is one of the key components of governance, right? If we can do our jobs at a maximum speed at all times, knowing there's nothing that we have to worry about, well, the business will always get value from that. And so governance doesn't just apply to workspaces, it also applies to the users and the data. That means that having those balanced controls gives us the flexibility to say, when we decide we need to make a change, we know that we can enforce and push users to adopt it because there's a standard, there's a template, right? Sports is a great analogy here. If you have no rules, there's simply nothing that you can do to say, well, when things went wrong, how do we course correct, right? And so having that level of governance allows us to fix and right the ship should something go a little bit left there.
Yeah, that and having the confidence, right? I mean, I addressed this in the opening, is that the key thing is that we don't want to impact users' experience. We don't want to hamper them. What we want to do, and I think it's your tagline, is we want to make sure that the business and the users have confidence that they're doing the right thing, and they can focus on the collaboration, because obviously that's driving some kind of value by doing it. Which, you know, in that case, maybe we can walk through a specific scenario. I mean, let's actually talk about the life cycle of something and bring up an example. Let's go to the next slide, and let's pick an example of how this actually operates within inside of a business and maybe a couple of different departments.
Yeah. So let's think about it, right? All those different levels that we were talking about, from enablement to balance controls, to being able to automate this process, and then being able to do ongoing management of it before we finally get to that point where disposition might have to occur in that user case scenario, right? It starts with the user, right? Being able to give them some level of, here's where you start. And so if we animate through this a little bit, what you're going to see is, if we give someone the ability to have some level of control, you can click into the next slides here. Or maybe the animation isn't there. There we go.
There it
So,
goes.
right, let's take Bob as an example. Bob might just be a manager, and his whole job might simply be to create workspaces that individuals might require. Or Bob might be a part of a specific department. And so maybe he's not a manager for all of IT, but he might be a business user who's just responsible for a subset, right? Maybe HR or legal, right? In that case, Bob has no idea what type of workspace he requires, right? There's a whole plethora that M365 provides you. Frank already talked about this. Microsoft makes it easy to collaborate. They don't make it easy for you to have context and know what you need. And so having the proper governance strategy, we can start to give Bob that level of confidence via things like questionnaires, which will basically say, if we ask the right questions to Bob, we can guide Bob to what they'll actually need. But not every single type of workspace should have the same level of flexibility, right? In the case of a SharePoint site, we might say that we want someone to oversee it, because what we don't want is to balloon the overusage of SharePoint, right? There's always going to be that quota in M365 that you're going to cap that. But even if we don't have that IT level, right, and we just think about it from the business standpoint, there is a cost associated with M365 beyond just the licensing. And so at that point, you have to think about storage. So each one of these different types of workspaces has their own unique value. Setting the right type of questions up front can guide Bob to know what they need, and then it allows IT to put certain controls in place, such as lifecycle management, that would say, maybe you don't need this workspace indefinitely, right? Perhaps this workspace really only was needed for the duration of a particular project. Maybe we spun up a team just for us to work for 6 months or a year. Once that's done, the problem goes all the way back to those original slides we were talking about. Microsoft makes it easy to collaborate. They don't make it easy to enforce and govern and control it. And so what you end up with is hundreds and thousands of sites, potentially, and you might just be a 50 user seat organization. Imagine if that starts to scale up to large organizations.
Well, and what's interesting is it's not even about Bob, right? Because Bob, he might be a member of a certain department, but he interacts with other departments. He interacts with HR, he interacts with legal, he interacts with sales, and so each one of those are going to have their own policies and their own governance guidelines, not just for the department, but on certain types of data sets. And Bob's got to navigate all that. So it's not enough for me to think about what permission should I give Bob. That's kind of really, downplaying some of the complexities. So let's take a look at what happens if you take Bob and you put him in a situation where there's a couple of different departments involved. Kristen, let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, and this goes back to your point, right, of what does governance mean, right? At its core level, governance is for the business. Each and every one of these scenarios we're talking about, right, whether it's workspace governance, the user offboarding process, these are all about creating standards and templates that guide the business and the individuals within that business to know how to actually collaborate. And so to your point, Steve, right, whether it's Bob, whether it's Jay, whether it's Steve or Frank, it doesn't matter who you are. You need something that dictates, right? How should I be able to collaborate? Under what control should I be able to collaborate? Potentially where I should be able to collaborate, and effectively make sure that someone has visibility and oversight into this. Because at a moment's notice, I might leave or I might be terminated. And if I am, well, the reality is the business continues. But in order for the business to continue, there has to be a process in place that ensures those business critical applications or workspaces I was managing, working on, and the data that's critical within them doesn't get lost and doesn't potentially become a risk in and of itself. Because data that's orphaned may not necessarily be lost, but I can assure you it can become risky if someone was suddenly granted access to that brand new team that might have had all of our employees' data within it, right? Being able to see someone's social security number, not necessarily a good thing that an IT person could see that. You might trust them now, but it doesn't mean you're going to trust them forever. And so the reality is creating these different types of templates that different departments can adhere to, or different business units, it begins to allow us to say that if we created a workspace where Steve and I are collaborating, we have no reason to work externally. So we're going to make sure that with that template, that team has external sharing disabled. And so all of this then starts to bleed into a little bit of the full top level down, right? Because we've talked a little bit about the workspaces, we talked a little bit about the users, but users ultimately operate on data. And so being able to take that full circle, going from that IT governance to that operational governance to the users and then finally to the data, means each and every one of these points has to have some level of oversight that ensures that the information that we're sharing, the information that we're collaborating on, it all meets a specific standard. And that standard can be very loosely defined. It doesn't necessarily have to be overly critical. This is where AvePoint and this is where Forthright come in, right? Because we can help organizations ensure that regardless of how strict you need to be, we can create a well-defined framework for you from a governance standpoint that will make sure that you adhere to your specific requirements. Those requirements they will kind of take a tiered approach, right? Which all of the points that you're seeing here, these don't just talk about data, they don't just talk about users, they're not just about workspaces. It's about taking that framework and applying it wherever you are in your governance journey. And going back to that point of the puzzle, regardless of where we start, whether you're worried about the data, you're worried about the users, you're worried about what the users can do, you're worrying about some level or process specifically within optimizing that whole structure, these different points, they all require that you have that framework built first. Because without the framework, you can potentially run into scenarios where you lose your data. And that data process, right, requires a solution. And so I'll stop and pause here for a second, right? Everything that we've talked about has given someone, right, whether it's a user, the business, whether it's going to be an IT admin, someone has been granted access to something, they have potentially managed something, they have to oversight to something, but what they don't necessarily have is context to it, right? You can have all the keys you want in the world, but if you don't have some level of classification, something that defines what this information is, what it means to the business, how do you actually know what to apply governance to, right? So let's take an example. The document was tagged as confidential. I know that internally, if we have defined our governance strategy appropriately, that means some individuals should not be able to see it. It actually might not even be able to be externally shared. Being able to define that, being able to then take those definitions and push specific outcomes to them ensures that we're going to be able to keep data in the correct locations under the correct guidelines so that it can't possibly create a risk, right? And those risks that we're trying to manage all require that there is some level of visibility and oversight. Because even if we are reactive, if we can at least see the information, if we can at least understand the information, if there's context to it, we can then start to build out and validate that whoever had access to this data, what they did with that data, but more importantly, maybe even why they did what they did with that data. That level of reporting, auditing, all of this builds the confidence that someone might have in your organization to say, we understand governance is important. We aren't necessarily at the most highest level of governance today, but by being able to take these tiered approaches, right, we can start to build these processes that will allow us to effectively get to a governance level of an organization that shows true adoption of M365. But not everyone's going to be at the same level, and that's okay.
So let's take this to the next step. Let's go back to our example. Kristen, let's go to the next slide. Let's go back to our example about user offboarding, because now we can explore this a little further and talk about why this becomes so important and things that maybe most people don't actually think about.
Yeah, and Frank's done a great job of kind of talking through this, right? The reality is that we've talked all about that permission set. We've talked all about who had access to what, but we've also talked about what happens when someone leaves the organization and what happens to their data. If I were to remove that user was to get deleted, sure, we might have the ability to grant access to the other information, but what about the data that gets immediately lost, right? Things like those business critical apps. There's no safeguard for that. And so part of your governance strategy shouldn't just be about change management. It shouldn't just be about the templatization process. It should also be about safeguarding yourselves from risk. That means having a means to retain the data, having a means to retain the information that was created, and that can include metadata, right? Who created it? When did they create it? Because for legal reasons, if you don't know when the document was created, that doesn't necessarily help you, right? All of that requires that there is some level of oversight for not only keeping the data and information, but then reallocating it to the new person, right? So when Jay leaves the organization, granting Steve access to that data and information ensures that those business critical applications, they stay in play, they stay available. But again, we're not exposing it to just anyone in the organization.
Well, and also giving visibility, because you as the employee, Bob, has now shared this data with numerous people before. And now that I have access to Bob's data, I don't actually understand who he shared it with, why, how long it's shared out there for, is it even still relevant? Those are things that IT's finished, right? They've removed access, but from a business perspective, there's still a risk out there that we're kind of blind without thinking through these scenarios and understanding what happens long term. Frank, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in and maybe share an example or additional thoughts on this, especially around like Power Automate
Yeah,
and some of
I
the
actually,
impacts of the apps integrated with Teams.
yeah,
Well, you should turn your camera off.
I could do that. I think actually I wanted to try and jump in a little earlier, but I don't know if I was having audio issues or not. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Let's see. All right, let me know if you guys can hear me better.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, cool. So what I was going to jump in earlier, I think one of the things that we I think needed to level set with the audience on here is that we've done a really excellent job of explaining the importance of this process of offboarding. Is definitely one of those areas I think should grab everyone's attention. At this point in time, I'm sure some of you may be thinking, well, Jay, Frank, Steve, that stuff sounds awesome. I don't even have access to. I don't know what they can do, what applications or 365 environment they can do or have been touching and so I just wanted to make a quick call back to our other series because I think it's going to be helpful for everyone. The first of the series was talking about just understanding some of the risks, and I think that'll be the entry point to see your use cases of what you currently have out there. It's really easy to grab people's attention when they realize, as Jay said, having company proprietary data, whether that be social security numbers, keys to the kingdom, whatever you want to call that, sacred treasure, having that be externally shared. We discussed that in our first series, and we talked about some of the solutions to use with that, and that's really a great place to start from a call out perspective. Once you've addressed some of that and you're working through that, you'll then come into the next area, which is, okay, so we see all this action happening and we now have our controls in place around that, policies, have our insights, things like that. We then realize, well, what are we doing with who has access to all these different pieces of information in the sense of the applications, whether that be, Office, SharePoint, Teams, Yammer. I can just keep going on here. There's only like 60 different applications inside of Microsoft 365 and that just continues to grow. Anyway, so having access to that, understanding who's doing what, and then controlling it there. Remember, I mentioned that closed course on an F1 race. Creating a closed course, limiting essentially what can happen, allows to it's actually more of an empowerment than a distraction. And so I think that's something very important to recognize there. We talked about that in our second part of the series. And then now we're here and we want to really highlight what are those steps being built to. And Jay's kind of, highlighting here, like we need to have these overarching policies, right? If we just worried about, hey, this file and it has access, that's external access or not, that's cool. We got to go beyond that. We got to step it up a little bit and go into, all right, here's my job function. And we talked about that questionnaire that got presented earlier with that Bob slide, and having now orchestration engine in between allows for us to now track the activity in a much more meaningful way, as opposed to the giant list of audit logs that we highlight. These contextual elements are all being generated through software, and then now the question is, the software is going to present that to you, but understanding what that means for your organization, that's where guidance, that's where expertise comes into play, and that's where helping you develop your offboarding processes for the different team members, the different departments, a general one, situations where something hasn't been defined. What do you do in that kind of situation? Some of you guys may be in a situation where you have a unique experience. You have only one person that does this. This is common in smaller organizations, but even in large organizations, you have only one XYZ role or function, and then that person is no longer there, been replaced, or whatever the case may be, and accounting for all that. So I just wanted to point that out and take a moment there, because I think that some of the audiences that haven't been with us for all the other ones should hear that and can kind of connect all those dots.
That's a great point too, and I want to be respectful from everybody's time. And so I think I'm going to just hit this really quick. And Jay, if there's something critical, you can jump in. But one of the things we showed earlier is that there's this loop, there's a cycle, right? And some people are starting at at the very beginning. Most of us are already in it. We're already in the loop. I mean, we're past that point, right? And we are at different points of maturity. And therefore, the service is on stepping up our game, as Frank said, so we can really understand the role and what's happening in the various impacts, because it goes way beyond just the file systems with all the power that's delivered with the 365. Understanding that means that we may come in at a different point, whether we're helping you modernizing, whether we're helping you add some resilience, whether it's a control mechanism that you need. There's a series of processes and tools and questionnaires and thought leadership, frankly, that we can work with you on and kind of walk you through this process. And as something to leave behind, Kristen, if you can go to the next slide real quick, I want you guys to kind of think about these questions. We're going to poll the audience really quick before we let you go. And some of you might be able to say yes to one or two, maybe all of them, maybe none of them. If you can read these 5 questions real quick and think about how many can you actually answer yes to. Because what's going to happen is I'm going to be able to kind of guide you in what the next step would be based on how many questions you're answering yes to. So maybe take a moment to read these for each of you, and then we'll bring up a poll real quick so you can share some feedback with us. All right, great. Let's see if you guys can provide some responses here real quick. Tell us where you felt your organization is sitting right now. How are we doing on the polls, Kristen?
We have about half the people voted so far. So
okay, we'll give you guys a moment or two. All right, for those of you that shared, we appreciate it. So if you take a look at, let's see, okay, wow, all right, well then this makes the next conversation very, very easy. If you take a look at, let's keep on going to the next slide, there you go. If you're able to answer, 5 or 0, you're going to be somewhere in this maturity curve. And our goal is to help each organization on their own path. And it doesn't mean that everybody has to be at 5 at the top, but obviously you're here because you have some concerns and you're trying to improve upon your current situation. So let's go to the next slide. If you scan the QR code, you can book an appointment with us. It's a free consultation. And essentially, look, most of you answered in the 0 to 1. We can help you for sure. And one of the places that we would start with is we do an audit for you. So we can give you the situational awareness that you need. And then that can lead to specific guidance on tools and services to bring you to the next level. If you're at the 2 to 3, which many of you were, well, you're on your way. That's great. And then at that point, let's talk about how we can actually leverage these tools, because you at that point have a situational awareness of kind of where you're at, and you probably understand specific challenges. And if you're in the 4 or 5, where you were able to say yes to 4 or 5 of those questions, well, then you're doing great. Then it's a matter of how can we add some automation to what your processes are to reduce the overhead of maintaining that kind of governance and compliance, give you better and more real-time situational awareness, and essentially make your organization more efficient, because you're already on your way. You've got a lot of things defined. We'd love to talk to you. We definitely want to thank all of you for joining us today. I think we could easily speak a little bit more, but we're definitely out of time. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to send you a pre-engagement questionnaire. This will help with that conversation, whether it's internally or when you book an appointment with us. It will help guide and start that conversation. Take a look at this, read these questions. It's a PDF that we'll send you where you can actually fill it out, and it's a good place to help us focus the conversation when we do get together. And I think with that, I'm going to thank Jay and Frank and Kristen for joining us today. Sorry for some of the audio challenges we had today. Really appreciate everybody's time, and wishing you a fantastic week. Thank you again for joining.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.